Hello and welcome to Dialogue. It's been 2 weeks since Ukraine launched its cross-border offensive against Russia early this month. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has used the initial success to argue for lifting restrictions on the use of Western-supplied long-range weapons against Russia. At the same time, Russian forces continued to make gains in key areas of Donbas. What is the situation on the ground? Will Zelensky be able to achieve his goal of creating a buffer zone inside Russia? And as the fighting intensifies, are the prospects for peace slipping away? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Diesen from the University of South-Eastern Norway, Alexandros Schulman, Northwest England Coordinator with the Works Party of Britain, and Peter Zalmayev, Director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Well, I will start with you, Professor Diesen. The Ukrainians have made a surprise push into the Russian territory. The incursion has entered its third week officially. So, what do you make of this rather surprise and, I would say, rather successful operation?
Well, it was a surprise, but I guess the reason why it was a key surprise was that it didn't necessarily make that much sense, given that this was not really that very strategic territory. Now, I would agree that it can be seen as a success to some extent, given all the territory which was taken. But I think the overall view is that this is not necessarily how success is measured, given that this is a war of attrition, in which the main objective is to exhaust the adversary. So while the Ukrainians have taken all this territory, I guess the main risk, which has been recognized actually by all sides, the Ukrainians, NATO, and Russia, is that it comes at potentially a great cost, which was predictable and which we're already seeing. That is, the Ukrainian army was already to a large extent exhausted, lacking in manpower and equipment. And now, with this invasion of Kursk, we see that they're losing a lot of manpower and a lot of equipment. So one can measure, of course, success in the territory which has taken, but the problem is it's very much wide in the open. Its forces have been stretched out. It has rather unreliable supply chains, if you will, in which it makes it difficult even to get fuel in. And it's very easy for the Russians to start to knock out a lot of the military equipment. Also, it's questionable whether or not they can actually keep or hold this territory, given that it's very difficult to dig in when, for example, engineering equipment can't really make it into this the Russian territory. So on this aspect, well, it can be seen as success as well as a failure. But a key secondary issue, which is actually more important, is also that the Ukrainians diverted a lot of troops from important areas down in Donbas, especially as the Pokrovsk front is now collapsing. And so many in Ukraine are also asking the question, why are all their best men and equipment being sent into holding a territory within Russia of no clear strategic purpose, when they actually had proper fortified lines, which they could instead have been holding in Donbas, which the Russians are instead plowing through now as a result of them being not sufficiently manned. So there's many ways of looking at this conflict, of course, and it all depends how the Ukrainians will play their hand. They could do many things. They could disrupt the Russian logistics. They could make some other gains. But at the moment, it looks like this was a huge risk, which will come at an immense cost. So I wouldn't necessarily define it as a success in those terms.
Many ways to look at the recent developments. So Alexandros, the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov, has basically pointed a finger at the United States, basically saying that the U.S. has played a role in this recent incursion of Russian territory. In his words, without the U.S. orders, the Ukrainian side would not have attacked the Russian territory. Do you think there's a role played by the U.S. side?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, from the very beginning of this conflict, it's been very much a proxy war between two major powers in the world, military powers, that is. I would also, though, add that there has been a role played by the British side in tandem with the Americans and I'm pretty certain that this attack and incursion into Kursk was conducted in tandem with both parties, both the British consultation and American consultation. I do not think that the Ukrainians made that decision on their own, and it's been shown pretty much so in throughout the course and duration of this war.
Mm-hmm. Well, whether there's order from the U.S. or not, there's obviously a part of the Russia is under control of the Ukrainian side. Peter, welcome to the show. So
the program is
tell us.
on.
Hello, Peter.
So,
Hello, Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. We are talking about the recent developments. 2 weeks, the Russian territory, Kursk, has been under the control of the Ukrainians. When it comes to the recent military operation, some observer claims the spirits, from the Ukrainian side, are unexpectedly high among the soldiers, and the morale boost is, quote, simply colossal. So tell us, what is the consideration of the Ukrainian side to launch such a surprise attack?
Well, yes, indeed, to boost the morale has been very important, but also the other goal is to show up Vladimir Putin's regime for what it is. It's been so fixated on Ukraine, it's forgotten to defend its own borders. It's increasing pressure on Vladimir Putin. It's increasing disagreements within the elite. I wouldn't get my hopes up about any sort of discontent on the part of the population. No one really cares about what the population thinks in Russia anymore. Putin feels that he's mastered, population control perfectly. What it also does, and I think what Ukraine's greatest calculation is that it will eventually force Russia to start withdrawing some of the troops it has fighting in the Donbas. And I'm talking about those highly paid, highly experienced soldiers, unlike the conscripts that fell pretty quickly when Ukraine attacked Kursk. We're talking about battle-hardened soldiers that are now creating a lot of problems for Ukraine having to defend the Donbas. There are already indications as of today that Russia may have started moving some of those troops from Chasiv Yar, which has been a crucial hotspot in this war. And if that is the case, this means that Ukraine's strategy short-term is playing out and is actually working out. And the other one, more long-term, would be that Russia would be forced into negotiations to put an end to Ukraine's occupation of Kursk. I would say that that is so far a remote possibility.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, obviously, at least temporarily, in the short term, that created some pressure on the Russian side, because it's a demonstration of a failure to protect your territory. It's at least an embarrassment for the Kremlin. And as Peter mentioned, probably it will work. Some of the Russian military unit will be drawn from some of the hot spots in the battlefields. That will create, let's say, less pressure on the Ukrainian side, probably more extended, more stretched for the Russian forces.
Well, I don't necessarily see that happening, simply because it's the Russians have much more forces available than the Ukrainians at the moment. We see the exact opposite. That this incursion into Kursk has drained a lot of the best Ukrainian soldiers and their best equipment. And as a result, we see instead that the front lines in Donbas are falling apart. Look at New York, which just collapsed, and the Russians entered Toretsk. But of course, the most important front line now is toward Pokrovsk, because this is a key, indispensable logistics center for the Ukrainians in Donbas. And this will likely now also fall. Now, given that the Russian front lines are moving quicker now in Donbas, it's an indication of exactly the opposite, that the Ukrainians diverted a lot of their best men, but the Russians didn't necessarily do this. And indeed, Putin just came back from Chechnya, in which it looks like more of the Akhmat brigades will start to look towards moving towards Kursk instead. So I think the Russian can dip into reserves, while these reserves are something that the Ukrainians don't necessarily have. So I think also the idea that the main goal is to enhance negotiation, will have a negotiation bargaining chip. I also don't think this is necessarily correct, because I don't think the Russians would even want to sit down with Ukraine until every Ukrainian soldier has left Russian territory. And also this, in the Western media, there's so much obsession with the ability to humiliate Putin. But again, I think this could have achieved the opposite, because in the past, many Russians perhaps had a mixed feeling about the invasion of Ukraine, given all the suffering that has taken place. But this has now changed the whole dynamic of the war. It's now a war of national liberation, one in which NATO countries have participated in the invasion of Russian territory. This is creating longer queues in the recruitment offices rather than shorter. So I don't necessarily think that all the expectations which in NATO we have been betting on will actually play out. Furthermore, I think a key objective of this invasion of Kursk was to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. We can't really say that open, because it's not very popular among the public in NATO if we're involved in trying to seize nuclear power plants. But also, given that this objective seemingly failed, it's also not something one wants to bring up. But I still think that, again, as every side recognizes, this was a very risky move, and I think it's not playing out as it could have, as at least it was hoped, on NATO and the Ukrainian side.
Mm-hmm. Alexandros, of course, for whatever is to happen, there are a lot of variables. It depends on their actions or reaction from both sides. So far, what we are seeing is initially there's a slow response from the Russian side, and now we are seeing President Putin visited Azerbaijan, North Ossetia and Chechnya. So it seems like he doesn't care that much about the situation in Kursk. So what is the Russian plan? Are they going to have a retaliatory offensive, to drive the Ukrainians out, or they are not in a hurry to fight in Kursk?
I can't personally answer for Russian military tactical plans, but what it appears is simultaneously, whilst the Ukrainians are making incursions into vast areas of land, but that are sparsely populated, may I add, in the Kursk region, the Russians are extending westwards and northwards into the Donbas area. And it seems to me that there's been a spectacular gamble that's been played here. As Professor Diesen reiterated, strategically and tactically, this doesn't seem to make sense. It's as if Zelensky or Sursky has made an all-for-nothing gamble in which they're preparing to sacrifice the Donbas in return for incremental incursions into Kursk. We've seen that before there was some preparedness made by the regional command in Kursk, and they started training militias. That was after Belgorod incursions earlier this year by the Ukrainian forces. But it can be said that this wasn't enough, and it was clearly seen as not enough. The Ukrainians have sent their vast amounts of better troops from areas in Donbas into Kursk, and they've made rapid gains using rapid armament columns.
Mm-hmm. Peter, picking up. Peter, President Zelensky has talked about creating a buffer zone in Kursk. Tell us more about that. That means the Ukrainian forces will continue to hold this region, if not penetrating further or deeper into the Russian territory. So what's the plan now?
Well, indeed, moving deeper and trying to threaten larger population centers such as the city of Kursk, which still lies about 80 kilometers from Ukraine's lines, that is a risky move, stretching its lines logistically. I mean, we already have precedent of that at the outset of this war, when the Russian army was stretched out so thin that Kiev in 3 days turned out to be not a workable strategy. Ukrainians are very wary wary of that precedent. They are going to be very careful before they get stretched too thin, meaning too deeply into Russia. I think we're now talking about broadening potentially to some areas in the neighboring Belgorod. Yes, this would be a zone sanitaire, sanitary zone that would neutralize the threat of Russian troops attacking Sumy, which is a region right across the border. That also, I think, brings to mind what the Russian side has claimed its goals were in Kharkiv, to create a sanitary zone. So if anything, this would be another example of a sort of trolling, if you will, by the Ukrainians, when it explains its actions to its Western allies. Look, we're not doing anything that our enemy is not doing. We're not there as an occupying force. We do not claim that we're liberating these areas. This is Russia. And this is simply to improve our defensive positions, our fighting positions, in order to liberate our territory. So, and I've been very, cautious in my dealings with my Ukrainian colleagues, who sometimes use the word liberating one or another population center in Kursk. I've cautioned them not to use that language. That is not very careful, not very responsible. We're not there to liberate. We are there once again, to improve our position, and Ukraine's overarching goal remains liberating its own territory. We do not need an extra square kilometer of any other territory.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, earlier you said that the expectation is that the Russian unit will be drawn from other battlefields, so that will reduce pressure on the other front lines on the Ukrainian side. But then people would say, if you look at the long-term impact of this incursion. So basically, you have both sides are having a new front line, additional front line. Both sides will be stretched, with the very limited resources now. And as time goes on, people would say an expansion of the war of the front will benefit the side with stronger resources. I mean, in this case, actually, this is Russia.
Well, indeed, Russia has bigger resources. Russia has several times the size of Ukraine's economy, probably 5 times this, more than 5 times probably the population. We all know that. But the increasing sort of recruitment fees that Russia now pays, up to $20,000 to sign a contract with the army, means that it's running out of cheap soldiers. It's by increasing the price, it's sending a signal that the appetite for this war on the part of ordinary Russians is very low. And don't forget that the attacking side, and Russia remains predominantly the attacking side in this war, always, according to military history and military logic, spends more resources and greater numbers of soldiers killed as a result, 3 to 4 times. And that's been actually the logic, and it's played out the same way in the Donbas, where Russia is said to lose as many as 3 to 4 times more soldiers fallen in battle or wounded than the Ukrainian side. So yes, resources are not evenly matched, but with proper continuing help, assistance from its Western allies, I think, and with its own mobilization efforts, which have actually stabilized, I think Ukraine can continue this war on even terms, and once again, even once in a while, demonstrate incredible feats of asymmetrical warfare, which we have seen in Kursk.
Mm-hmm. Gulam, President Zelensky has made the case to the ambassador from Western countries recently. Basically he said that we should, shed this naive illusion of Russia being a fearsome superpower it appeared once was, and now they should continue with their military supplies and lift the restrictions of the use of the long-range weapons against Russians. So what's likely the next step from their Western allies? Do you think that Washington, Berlin, Brussels will be encouraged by the latest development, and then they will say probably double down their military support to the Ukrainians?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing coming from Zelensky. And of course, if you consider the Kursk invasion to be, to some extent, a PR stunt, it's also an important one because it's important to shift the narrative. Because if we're able to sell the story that the tide has turned or something, then it creates excitement among the Western public and is more likely to send more weapons to Ukraine. So this is kind of the irony that the more PR stunts it would take, which would unfavorably affect its attrition rate, the more weapons it's also likely to get. But in the terms of breaking red lines, this is also a key issue which Zelensky has made a point out of, that they could invade Russian territory, and I think everyone understands that NATO has been supporting this, not just in the planning but also now in the execution. And the main argument then is we don't have to worry about Russian red lines anymore because the Russians won't defend them. So this is also a way of, I guess, pulling the NATO countries into the war. I think that this rhetoric is something also that they're seeing on the Russian side, because for them, they see a dilemma. If they retaliate, then they might risk an escalation into a third world war. However, if they fail to retaliate, then it will only embolden NATO, and this is effectively what Zelensky is pushing for, further emboldening NATO to do more long-range strikes and get NATO deeper involved into this war. But I've made the point that I think this is based on a myth that the Russians do not retaliate. I mean, keep in mind that it was after the West toppled the government in Ukraine that the Russians retaliated by seizing Crimea. It was after sabotaging the Minsk agreement and refusing to give any security guarantees to Russia that Russia retaliated by invading in 2022. And it was after the NATO began to send heavy weaponry to the Ukrainians that NATO decided to annex these 4 oblasts of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. So this idea that Russia won't retaliate, I think, is a very dangerous one indeed. If you take the pulse of what's happening in Moscow now, the NATO's involvement in the invasion of Russia, this is something that will possibly have huge consequences. So I think we're definitely moving into dangerous territory, and so what Zelensky is saying is quite important, because this is something that Russia also can't permit, this idea that there won't be any consequences, that its red lines should no longer be restricted or respected. So there's a huge pressure on Russia now to restore its deterrent. And this means that we're going to risk what Russia didn't want to risk, which is a third world war.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's we'll wait and see. But Alexandros, if you look at the Western reaction or response, we are not sure whether it's related to a recent development or not. The German government has said that they are going to stop new military aid to the Ukrainians, and according to their plan, they are going to further slash future assistance to Ukraine so as to limit their spending, to cut their spending. How will that affect not only the support to the Ukrainians, but also maybe impact other Western or European nations?
Well, there's been tremendous backlash upon European governments throughout. There's been we've seen numerous protests culminating, even recently, and there's the cost of living crisis that's been happening, and that's happening simultaneously whilst our governments are sending billions upon billions, in Keir Starmer's words in Britain, 3 billion a year until it ends. And this has had a backlash upon countries like Germany, who are suffering, especially since the Nord Stream bombing, and they're not in a position anymore, I believe, to send vast amounts of weapons, and the general public in Europe are growing increasingly weary, and that's going to send a message, and that's probably part of the reason of the timing of the Kursk incursion.
Well, Peter, earlier you also mentioned about bolstering the negotiating position of the Ukrainians by incurring into Kursk, the region. So, in response to that, the Russians said that, we're not in the mood of basically negotiating with the Ukrainians. People would say that's actually delayed the peace process, or, if there is a process, or delayed the peace negotiation. What's your response to that? Do you think there's any possibility of having those negotiations, like in Qatar and in Turkey, in other parts of the world, as scheduled, if not cancelled?
That story remains murky, I think, but the short answer to your question is no. I don't think that Kursk significantly changed, the prospects of peace simply because Vladimir Putin was never negotiating or even considering having peaceful negotiations in good faith. He went into Ukraine in order to dominate Ukraine, in order to bring it to its knees and to make it a quasi-independent state, sort of like what Belarus is. He would probably have allowed it to keep its flag, maybe a modified version. Maybe he would have made to have Ukraine revert to its Soviet-era flag, the way Lukashenko has done in Belarus. But that was the very goal. The previous speaker said that Putin went in, and then only after NATO started sending heavy weapons, that's when he decided to annex those 4 oblasts. That's, I think, has its logic backwards. Putin went in with his 19th century colonial warfare goals. That's exactly what's been happening. I don't think it would have moved the needle in either way had Ukraine continued on this path of talking about negotiations, simply because Vladimir Putin only has one sort of negotiation in mind for Ukraine, and that is on the terms of Ukraine's capitulation. That is the only true signals we've ever received from Vladimir Putin. All this talk about, wanting to sit down and have peace talks is directed at the global south, at other players, other actors who are Russia's current allies, to sort of present Russia as the peaceful party here. But they have no basis in fact. Once again, Vladimir Putin will only be content with Ukraine's capitulation, no other terms.
Glenn, before the incursion, of course, there were several, let's say, overtures, multiple overtures, I would say, from the Ukrainian side, basically sending out signals they are ready to negotiate, to solve this problem through negotiation. But obviously, looking back, it's more like a strategic calculation. But anyway, with the incursion, what about the prospects of the negotiation?
Well, negotiations, the core of it has to still go back to the original issue, which is restoring the neutrality of Ukraine to end NATO expansion. This is why also I'm a bit skeptical of this argument that the Russians never negotiated in good faith, because it was the Western countries which admitted that they sabotaged the Minsk agreement for 7 years. And also, it's important to state the facts, which is that even the Ukrainian government confirms that on the first day after the Russians invaded, they reached out to the Ukrainians to start discussing peace. And on the third day, they had agreed to start peace talks. And as the Ukrainian side recognized, the negotiators there, the mediators, as well as the Russian side, was that the Russians were willing to make compromise on everything besides the one thing, that is an end to NATO expansion. They had to restore their neutrality because, and this is not something controversial, this has been recognized for 30 years, that Russia cannot live with NATO in Ukraine. This is seen as an existential threat. So we've seen these efforts to negotiate. We've seen that they put forward what was reasonable security demands, which is not put American weapon systems in Ukraine. But we also learned that the Istanbul peace talks, it ended simply because the Americans and the British effectively put an offer on the table of Zelensky. That is, they could not support any peace negotiations, but if the Zelensky would fight, then they would give him all the weapons they would need. And I think this is also why it's important to see that this war is to a large extent a NATO war against Russia as well. And I think that over time, the Ukrainians will also begin to realize that this is not NATO helping Ukraine. This is NATO using Ukraine as a proxy against the Russians.
Stop there, Professor. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.